Hello and welcome to Elizabeth McDonald, and welcome to my guests, and welcome to our community members. Welcome to Amplify with Mohamed. I'm really excited to be doing this podcast, and in full transparency, if you're watching this, this will likely be a recorded version of my conversation with Elizabeth, and sometimes we do have live versions, but this is the very first branded Amplify with Mohamed. And Amplify with Mohamed is a podcast that addresses what we are doing in London-Fanshawe, what we can do better, and what I hope to do as your member of parliament. But today we have a very special guest with us who is bringing her passion and her purpose and talking about what she is doing to raise awareness around the various issues that plague our communities, and not just in London-Fanshawe or just in London, but generally in Canada, and what we can do better as individuals, what we can do better as community members, and what we can do better and hold our elected officials accountable to also helping us with to improve situations on the ground and in our communities. So welcome to Elizabeth McDonald. Before I get into your bio, Elizabeth, I just want to give you a hearty welcome and say thank you for being my guest this morning.
Thank you for having me, Mohamed. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure. So Elizabeth, I'm just going to give my guests a bit of background on who you are. So Elizabeth is a Canadian multimedia journalist interested in our communities, the political process, the environment, mental health, advocacy, decriminalization of substance abuse, climate change, social justice, and anything animals. Hobbies include writing, photography, running, and slacklining. And I have to admit, I don't know what that is, but you can explain to us, hopefully. Elizabeth is a recent graduate from Western University with a double degree in history and political science, who is also an incoming graduate student to the School of Journalism. Congratulations. Writing in media at the University of British Columbia. Elizabeth has been writing about London's homelessness situation, community and local resources, and you can check her out on various local outlets such as London-Fanshawe. And today we'll talk about what is your passion and what is your purpose and why you are trying to make a difference in our community. So welcome today, Elizabeth, and thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So the first question, before I ask you to tell me a bit about yourself in your own words, are you leaving this beautiful community and going to British Columbia, or are you going to be virtual like the rest of the world right now?
So I will be moving to Vancouver. I actually just received housing secured last night, so that's great.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Rentals in Vancouver can be quite competitive, but luckily I've had some friends who are in the area and have assisted me. But we are looking forward and tentatively should be in-person learning for this fall. I believe Western's most likely doing that as well, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a daughter at Western, and she's saying, Dad, if I don't get in there in person, I don't know what I'll do. So I know how important that is. And while the London community will miss you, and while you'll still be part of the community. And I think your devotion and dedication to highlighting some of the issues that the community has will always bring you back here, even if it is virtually. But we want to wish you the best as you start your new next leg of your journey. And I'll admit, Vancouver is one of my favorite places in all of Canada. You've got the ocean, you've got the mountains. So good luck to you there. And I think that you'll also be a gift to that community. And because some of the things we'll talk about today also plague that community. And as happy as I am to say I'm Canadian, and this is one of the best places to live in the world, if not the best, we're not without fault. We have a lot of work to do. And the we here is a collective we. So a lot of times I think we look to our governments to say that they need to solve the problems. I think governments need to make sure that the money that is that they're working with and the policies that they're writing are addressing the issues that communities are experiencing. But there's a lot that we can do as individuals as well. And I shouldn't say but I should say and that there's a lot that we can do as individuals, because this has to be a concerted effort. We have to hold our elected officials accountable to do the work that they, promised us that they would be doing when, they gave their election speeches. We have to make sure that all various levels of government are working together, but we also have to make sure that different communities understand what they can do to bring the change that their various communities need. And here in London, I grew up in the London area, and I've been living on and off in London for maybe 25, 30 years. Since I came to Canada, I've lived in the area since 1976. We've got a lot of work to do. I'm proud to be a Londoner. I'm proud to be Canadian, but I see daily examples of homelessness. And while I'd like to blight this out and get rid of it in the entire world, I am only in control of my own situation here. I can only reach out to my community and help my community. And I can be that change that I want to see. So, I've taught my children, when they see people who are less fortunate, who are currently experiencing homelessness, and I'm really careful with the language I use with my children, because when we start branding people and calling them homeless, that's an adjective. And people who are experiencing homelessness, when you can refer to the situation as a transient one, then we have hope that we can do something to make it better, as opposed to calling somebody, a homeless person themselves, and then all of a sudden they're branded that way. Or people who are experiencing substance abuse. And I really want to go there in a moment, because you've lived this, you've felt it, you've written about it, and it's something very close to your heart. So with that in mind, that's where I'd love for us to take the conversation today, Elizabeth. But I'm going to ask you, who is Elizabeth? In your own, words, can you introduce us to you and what makes you Elizabeth, and what gets you up every morning, why you want to be the change in the world?
Oh, that's a tough one. What makes me Elizabeth? I'm a person first. I think all of us really just need to focus on the fact that everybody that we come across has had some lived experience in an area that we may not have been subject to. And because of that, it's important to really listen to what they have to say. What makes me me? I am a passionate athlete. I grew up in sports, and in my adulthood and in my recovery, I've really found that as an outlet and as a natural solution to some of the frustrations that I can find in my life. So as you said, I'm a very passionate runner. I'm also interested in the sport of slacklining, and I'm just going to touch on that and plug it for a moment. Slacklining, it's not as well known in London as it is on the West Coast, but it's the art of balancing on a piece of tensioned nylon webbing between two anchor points. So it's similar to tightrope walking, but it's not a tensioned rope, it's a piece of nylon. It originated in the rock climbing community, I believe in the 70s in Yosemite. But with the advent of modern technology, it's become more accessible for anyone and everyone of all ages and demographics to go outside and just learn how to improve their balancing skills.
Interesting. So you walk on a piece of nylon and you balance yourself on it.
Yeah, you sort of use your body to, yeah.
Well, I'd love to use that metaphor for how you've lived your life as well. While I think you probably get a lot of, it's a challenge for you to maybe walk that tightrope and know that you're in control and you get to choose how you're balancing. I know in some of the experiences that you've had in your life, you've dealt with substance abuse, you've recovered. I think now since it's 2018 that you've had your last alcoholic drink, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And, the image of us walking on a very thin piece of fabric or tightrope and being able to balance and at any time lose that balance and falling off. It's a lived reality that you've dealt with for the better part of your adult life. And I thank you, first of all, for expressing that vulnerability. A lot of people, because of the stigma, don't want to talk about it, or because they think I don't want people to know my personal life. And I respect that. And you choose to talk about it. I'd like to hear why. And then how did you deal with it? And how are you dealing with it?
So personally, I choose to be open about recovering from issues relating to alcohol use because stigma didn't really help me recover in the first place. I personally, I used a 12-step program called Alcoholics Anonymous. It's been around for quite a while. There are many different approaches to harm reduction as well as recovery. And so I think there are many different outlets that people could use, but that happened to be the one that worked for myself. I'm open about it just because I think, for one, it sort of holds me accountable in some respects. It also lets people know how serious I do take the fact that I don't drink. Drinking is very normalized in many cultures, and I don't think that that's inherently a bad thing, but I think we should also be willing to normalize the choice not to drink. It was something that I struggled with in terms of the amount that I consumed throughout my teen years and my 20s. And I did have various points where I stopped and then decided to fall off again. And with slacklining, there's nothing wrong with falling down. It's just the courage to get back up that really is what's important in my opinion. And while I will have 4 years without drinking in February of 2022, really in my view, each day is a new day, and what's important is I do what I can for myself today, and then deal with tomorrow. While I do respect others' rights to privacy, especially regarding substance use and fears with stigma, I want to be as open as possible because for all I know, somebody else could be struggling with it and they think that it's just a personal problem and that nobody else has experienced that. And I think the biggest mistake that we can make is assuming that our problems are just our own and that other people haven't gone through them, because more often than not, other people have gone through them and they can offer some real advice and strength and just an ear to listen. I think that's what is most important, the ability to listen to somebody else's experience, not tell them what to do, but to just be a place of support.
Well, that's empathy, right? And when we look to, I in my full-time work right now, what I do is I'm a leadership, an executive consultant around emotional intelligence. And I work full-time with a company and around training, as well as I have my own business. And, but that's an insight that I bring. And I say insight because it has taught me a lot about myself as much as it's taught me about others, that we're not in this alone. And we don't have to live with the secrets or with the shadows of fear and not being able to express ourselves and being, shut down and turned down and kept down because of our stigma. And many people are hurting in our communities. They're not able to function. They're not able to show up in their places of work or in their community or even in their homes and be able to be great support structures for their families, their loved ones, and people around them. And so this is a much deeper issue than any of us are willing to really look at. We tend to just look at the surface and judge and stigmatize somebody, say, look what they're doing, or look what they're not doing because of their substance abuse. And it's easy when we don't think we have any issues to pass that sort of judgment. So and like yourself, I choose not to drink, and choice is incredible because it is the single most superpower that we have as human beings. And I respect those who choose to drink and to do it responsibly. But I don't know how much we've invested in our communities around education to make sure that people are making the right choices. So I think, and here I'll put on a government hat here, I think part of the reason people ask me is, what do you want to do differently? How would you like to help a community? And I'll say, well, look, we need to, if we're bleeding, we need to address it. Do we put on a Band-Aid? Do we figure out why we're bleeding? Do we have to do surgery? So sometimes we need attention to a matter because we're currently suffering from it. But once we're better and we're healing and we'll continue to heal, how do we prevent future injuries? How do we make sure that other parts of our bodies are not being impacted by a negative lifestyle or a lifestyle that is less than empowering? And when we look at the community as one single body, because when part of our body hurts, it affects the rest of us. We as community members, when one person in the community hurts, it affects the rest of us. And we need, to your point, we can't always come with a solution, but we need to let them know that we're there. So when I look at people in my community who are hurting because of substance abuse and because of the stigma, and they have that less than branded on them, how do we help them? How do we go beyond? And to somebody who's lived through this, to somebody who has recovered from it, and I celebrate you every day, by the way, for being able to get up and recognize where you've been and where you're going. So I celebrate you for that strength. But what do you think we need to do? What do you think our communities need to do to breed that level of resilience, especially in our youth who may be making the wrong choices, and that can impact them for the better years of their adult life?
So there are multiple pieces to that puzzle. Addiction is a complex issue that doesn't just have a one-size-fits-all solution, and there are varying reasons for why people become addicted to a substance or involved in substance use. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is have really robust community supports and outlets. Another thing is ensuring that youth especially have mentors within their community, be it their family members or just programs of support where they can find something to do after school, be it through sports, peer-to-peer mentorship programs, ensuring that parents are making a decent enough wage that they can take time away from work if they need to, if their child is perhaps experiencing a mental health issue or just some youth behavioral issues as well. What else? Normalize and destigmatize, I would say. I think in a lot of ways we relegate substance use to illicit substances or even alcohol, for example, which is a legal substance. And we fail to recognize that each of us have our own escape in a way. Some people it's coffee, right? Like I drink coffee every single day, and that is a substance that has an effect on my body, whether I view it as an addiction or I view it as just a beverage, right? And so having a more wide lens on what we see as something that can be a repetitive behavior that has, to me, okay, so addiction to me is a repetitive action that has a negative consequence on your life and you can't stop it despite your attempts to do so. You know, breathing is a repetitive habit, but it's not an addiction because it has no negative effect on my life. And coffee, you know, it might make me anxious sometimes, so I live with that one. But alcohol for me, it was really impeding my ability to thrive in my life. But what didn't help in terms of my recovery is stigmatizing me for the way that I drank. Part of it was going to Alcoholics Anonymous and just being willing to talk with other people or another support group if you're not interested in that sort of model of recovery, because other people with experience can sort of let you know that it is okay to have this problem and that you can recover from it. More normalization and understanding in the medical community is important as well, I think, because you know, like all professionals, doctors are busy, and I think it can be easy to just sort of want to put a Band-Aid on the solution and not necessarily look at the whole person. And personally, I do think trauma is one of the biggest indicators for whether somebody may have a substance use disorder, and especially early childhood trauma is one of the factors that can really contribute to that, as well as having like a family predisposition to substance use, which can add a genetic component to it. So the whole wide spectrum of issues that we can tackle here.
Well, Education is a big part. You talk about because there's almost a glam aspect to a certain lifestyle that includes substances. And you mentioned something like coffee. I'm a great coffee, great coffee drinker. I am an avid coffee drinker. My son said to me yesterday, "Look how dark it is. How do you drink it?" And he said, your grandfather was, had a cafe back in Lebanon, and it's part of my family. And so I do recognize that coffee impacts me now. It impacts me in my health. And perhaps even because what impacts me in my health is impacting how I behave with others. Now, things like alcohol and substances and various substances, and legal and illegal drugs will affect us, not only us, but affect the way that we show up and how we interact with others. So now the ricochet of the ripple effect is impacting more people in our community, and we don't see it that way. And so I think education is not just when we're in the midst of abusing ourselves through substance abuse, but how can we prevent it? How can we educate around, before we start participating in this? How do we become more aware that certain things are going to harm us more than they help? So I think there's a certain level of education that needs to go around prevention. There's a certain level of education that needs to go around addiction, and for those who've already, dealing with that. And as you mentioned, for families, so I wonder, like, from your experience, you talk about parents who are able to be there, be present, and maybe even take time off work for their family members who are going through this. Did you find that that was something your parents had recourse to, or people that who've been through this? Do their parents have recourse to systems and aids in the community that help them deal with this, not just from an education point of view, but hey, I don't know if I can always take 2 weeks off work to sit with my child who may be involved in substance abuse. We're dealing with it.
So I was relatively lucky. My dad was retiring earlier, so he did have some time to spend with me. And I come from a 2-parent household as well, so that is another factor that did assist me. My parents were, for the early 2000s, relatively understanding of mental health issues, so I was provided with access to a counselor, which was helpful. And some of it, outside of the wraparound family and community support, does come down to the fluctuations in your life experience as an individual, because I went in and I went out with therapy throughout my teen years and then in my 20s. And so it can be difficult to really get a handle on an issue if you're not staying within the supports that are there. But once again, that's more of an issue related to mental health as well. I know another thing that I've sort of thought back on in my writing on the topic was I did attempt suicide, just a trigger warning, attempted suicide when I was about 15 years old. I was going through some emotional troubles, transitions to high school, issues with bullying, some substance use stuff was going on, and then just general teen years are a really difficult time for anybody. But I spent 2 weeks at the pediatric psych ward here in Victoria Hospital, and I was provided with support in that respect. But when I left, it wasn't a requirement, and I think there can be some issues with requiring people to see a mental health professional after an incident like that. But I do think there could have been a more robust system for individuals transitioning out of a mental health crisis, just because that is a fairly raw time. And I think in hindsight, I just wanted to move on from it and sort of get back into school and find a bit more balance with my social life and my academics. And throughout my later years in high school, I did do that. So that's wonderful. But not everybody has the support to do that. And I do think everybody would be able to benefit from having free access to a mental health care professional.
Right. And I think that's really important, is to know that we're also at different levels of government investing in these programs and making sure. And, with no disrespect to the difficulties you've been through, I would say that you're probably one of the stories that we can celebrate, that you've gone through this. You've come out on the other side. You're learning to balance.
Mm-hmm.
You're literally doing that in
Yeah.
your spare time as well. But you've also just graduated Western University with a degree in poli-sci, and I think history, and you're getting into journalism school. So this is a great story to tell. And you mentioned that you've come from a two-household family, and family that was able to be there and support you. And when I look at the community, our London-Fanshawe community, I can tell you that, in terms of across the nation, it has some pockets of poverty that are amongst the 10th poorest in our nation. So that's not acceptable. For me as a Londoner, as a Canadian, I think that is not acceptable, that we need to do better. So, in terms of, are we doing enough? I think we can definitely do better. We need to make sure that some of these services and some of the support networks that you're mentioning need to have strong advocacy of representation, that we can bring money and funds and these services into the community where we're seeing these more prevalent than in other parts of London. Right, and as I grew up and as a Londoner, and I worked in London in the community, I often heard east of Adelaide, and I always said to myself, why, right? And I do see that there are pockets in that community where we need to do better. Now, these are issues that go beyond just government, and they go to community, and they go to our support systems. But I do think we need to do better. And coming out of COVID and recognizing that people who are underprivileged, people who have been underrepresented, people who have already been dealing with substance abuse and poverty and housing, and who can even afford housing these days, right? And affordability issues. These problems and challenges have only been magnified through COVID. Women who, 90% of women who've been impacted with the she session, right? And so when we look at women who've had to recoil and back into the household to do more of their domesticated duties, right? And now trying to get more women back into the workforce. How are we supporting them? Now, I know that with the new Liberal budget that we have, we're trying to make daycare more affordable so that women can actually get back to work, and we can help families. And we need to do more, and we need to make sure that we're doing it sooner. My concern is when we don't do it for the communities that are hurting most. So when I look at that particular community, when we look at there's more homelessness issues in that community, more issues with substance abuse, we need to have these facilities in the community. I don't think it's fair to expect somebody to drive halfway across the city to get into a place where, right? So when people say, what can we do? Well, let's listen to the community members. Let's look at the issues that they're experiencing. And part of education is not being reactive, but is being proactive, thinking, what do we need to do differently? How can we do this better? So I'd like to ask you, when you were going through this, and you chose Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was one of the ways that you were healing, and I think it was Dean and the Dean program, I think I was reading something that you shared. What would have helped you differently? And especially now, if you can think about it in the light of COVID and how we know that more people have been impacted in that community because of COVID. We know COVID has hit more of the ethnic communities, people who already impoverished, dealing with issues of affordability. But what would have helped you particularly to maybe heal faster or differently?
I'm not sure if there's any one specific thing that would have really helped me heal differently. During COVID, I think one of the barriers has been not everybody has access to a computer or the internet to go onto a Zoom meeting. Then there's also issues with inclusivity with AA. Like it's still a fairly white male dominated program. And that's not necessarily
really?
Right. Well, not that, I don't want to say white male dominated in like a negative way. It's just alcoholism historically has been more relegated to be a male issue than a female issue. And the text is fairly old. It's from like the 1940s, and the program, I don't really want to like speak negatively about it because it's not a bad program at all. And there are women's meetings, and then there's men's meetings. But I think even just regular community-based meetings for people who are struggling with substance use, from like an agnostic lens, because it does have a bit of a religious or a God-based component to it. And that's also not a bad thing, right? There's different things appeal to different individuals. And I felt comfortable being there with that part of the program and being able to just sort of think of it from a different lens. But not everybody has that ability. And some people have had negative experiences with religion as well, which can sort of be an impetus to them feeling comfortable in that type of environment. So yeah, more community-based programs. I mean, I don't have a history with opioid addiction, but I know one of the issues with that is the areas where you can access either a safer supply, so pharmaceuticals that are prescribed, that are not tainted by street drug issues.
Right.
It's important to have those in varying communities, because if you're having to travel across the city to access your medication, that's and a whole day essentially, if you don't have access to a reliable vehicle, and then maybe you're having to take a day off of work. And then there's still some stigma within the medical community for providing that type of care, just because it's the medical community, and it's like all communities, we're evolving as this occurs. So.
And Elizabeth, I agree with you here. So whether we're talking about AA or even the medical community, we all have opportunity to grow. And I think that's why we need these conversations, just to look at what can we do better. This is how we started the conversation. We're not criticizing just for the sake of criticizing. And unfortunately, when we get into politics, politicians are so known for criticizing and saying what others aren't doing enough of. And what we need to do is find a goal that we can collectively work on that goes beyond. I saw politicians do this once during COVID, where we all decided that, hey, we need to do what's right for our Canadians and support Canadians. So I'm glad that happened. And I think when it comes to these issues, when it comes to safe houses, when it comes to substance abuse, opiates, when it comes to education, proactively, we need to think about, hey, put our partisan colors aside and let's look at what is the right thing to do and how do we do it right. And what happens, unfortunately, many of the times is we criticize. And even when a program is a good program, whether we're talking about childcare, whether we're talking about, let's child tax benefit or pharmacare, whatever it is that we're talking about, we tend to see it through the lens of our political stripes as opposed to the lens of the people who are suffering and who need our help. So, and to your point, we don't get help in there fast enough. If we're traveling across the city, then I'm likely not to take the day off work, and I'm not going to be able to be proactive in my own healing. And guess what? It's not going to happen. But I've heard from people who can't get it in their language. You mentioned about the certain sort of language that is through the lens of, let's say, a particular faith group. Let's say that I'm an Indigenous person and I don't want to go to a particular healing place where they are talking through the lens of a particular religion that has maybe been, for me, a religion of dominance and something that I view as that has pushed me away from my own community, right? Colonized me. I probably don't want to go there. And so what are we doing in terms of providing these services for people who don't speak English, for people who want to hear it through a lens of their own faith, right? And I think part of it is listening to people who are healing, need to heal, and working with community leaders from different parts of the community, ethnicity-based, language-based, whatever it is that we can consider this diversity, because diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. And we need to make an intentional decision to be equitable in the way that we provide programming and funding for programming, but we also need to make sure, to your point, people feel they belong and that they could thrive. And we're not going to get people to heal and talk about stigma and break down the stigma if we're only doing it through the lens of the dominant culture. Inclusion is not about you and I and the dominant privileged culture talking about how we think we should do this. It's actually sitting back, making sure that there's room at the table where decisions are being made for others who don't look like you and I, who don't speak our language, don't think like you and I, to find a place of the seat and to start educating the rest of us. And, I, as an aspiring politician, want to bring that sort of conversation to the table. I want to make sure that I don't have all the answers and others need to be present with me. And so consultation is very, very huge in terms of how do we engage community members when we're looking at what's happening right now with residential schools. We need more than just words of I'm with you, I'm praying for you, and I'm feeling for you. We need to, this is a genocide. Hundreds of years of colonization and putting people into a particular group of people into a situation where their rights and their privileges and their identity and its erasure and censorship. And, how do we give closure to the people who need to heal and move on? Well, you don't by continuing to erase their histories. And so how do we get better? I'm not an expert here, but I think we need to start listening to them. We need to engage them. And because now when we look at substance abuse within that community, and we know that it's higher in that community, but what happens is we start now to stigmatize it and to brand it and to say, well, yeah, this is the indigenous communities, right? When I grew up in the London area, guess what? When I came to London, it was acceptable to look at somebody who looked Indian, red Indian, and say, well, there's just a bunch of drunks. And I say that with no disrespect to it. That's the bias that we brought to the conversation. When I was in the early 80s and 90s in London as a student at Western, that long ago, that was what I saw on the streets. That was the language that was acceptable. And we do this now to other groups based on their faith or their ethnicity. And we need to be more proactive in ensuring those conversations are not being had, that we're countering that stigma, breaking it down, that we're introducing policies where hate is not tolerated, where we're not allowing people to put others down and keep them down. And so when we look at communities that continue to suffer, whether geographical communities within our larger community, or whether it's based on what makes them different, we need to get into those communities. We need to consult. We need to listen. We need to understand what they're going through. Because not everybody's going to have the wonderful story to be able to celebrate like you have. And I hope that you continue to celebrate it and to talk about it. And I appreciate what you're doing because it takes a lot of courage and a lot of strength, and probably daily you question yourself, can I show up today to talk about this? Can I continue to advocate? Because it hurts. I came from a background where I've been abused in terms of discrimination and bullying, and as an immigrant, and I bring that to my passion for wanting to represent people and amplify their voice and speak on their behalf, because I've lived it. It's different when I can talk about it as a bystander and say, I want to do something different because I believe, but I actually want to do something different because I've lived it. And to your point, advocating, speaking up, writing about it, normalizing it, letting people know that this isn't so uncommon. Hello, this is right here in our communities. So I want to thank you today for having that courage, finding that courage daily to speak about it and to advocate and to continue to write about it and to educate the rest of us. So thank you for doing that. And I just want to turn it over to you for any last minute thoughts of, how do we continue to amplify those voices that are struggling, voices who have been silenced, and voices who don't know that they have a voice?
Thank you, by the way, for having me on as well.
My pleasure.
To answer your question there, I think listening is the number one thing you can do, and just educate yourself on the lands that we are on. Don't presume that you know what somebody else's life experience is. That's number one for me. And just treat people with more compassion than you might think that you are capable of, because ultimately, I think most of us can actually connect much more than we realize if we're just willing to listen to somebody else's experience and not try to judge them for it, not try to tell them what to do or how to change, but just understand that when people tell you their life experience, it's not your job to qualify or to tell them that it is non-existent. And I can't speak to another demographic's experience with substance use or with recovery. And I think in many respects, I'm incredibly lucky to be where I am today. There is also the work that I put in too. So I think that that's important to reinforce in myself. But the sense of agency that I have in my life would not be here today if I did not gain access to support for recovery, have friends and family that were supportive of that recovery. And if I didn't vehemently believe that this is something that is important to my life and it's probably important to a lot of other people's lives, and that things can really get better. It takes time and it doesn't happen overnight, and there are ebbs and flows, and that's okay. With that, I don't think I have too much more to add, other than, especially with marginalized communities in London, the homeless population, I would people experiencing homelessness, I would really suggest that you just smile at people when you're out on the street and understand that if there is somebody who is sleeping rough outside, you have a home most likely to go to that night, and they don't. And so maybe try and have some compassion for their lived experience, because as much as I've heard people say, well, I can feel unsafe in this area, and maybe that's true. I think the person who's living on the street is also extremely unsafe in their scenario. So it's important to remember that there are multiple sides to stories here. So,
and you bring up a good point. I often say that we can't legislate goodness in people's hearts, right? You and I, as ordinary human beings, the best that we can do is be compassionate, be empathetic, and recognize that people are dealing with issues and having internal battles that the rest of us can't even comprehend. And so the smile, it's free and it goes a long way. And I've taught my children that when they do see somebody who is experiencing homelessness, rather than, we used to go and offer them food or drop money in their can, but right now my children have learned, because we've learned as a family, engage with them, have a conversation, and of course, practice being safe, especially today in a COVID situation, but engage. Ask them. I've role modeled to my children. If somebody says, "Yeah, I want money because I need to go buy drugs," I can't give you money to go buy drugs. Have you had breakfast? And then they said, "No, I haven't." I said, "What would you like for breakfast?" And then I'll go into the local store, restaurant beside me, and I'll get them breakfast. And recognizing that they can get their help for substance abuse from the right place, because giving them money to go and I don't want to encourage what they're already trying to discourage themselves from doing, but I do need to help them. And so I found that way to help. And it's a matter of doing our part. But I do think that as governments, we need to be looking at our communities and thinking how we can do more. So not only for people who are living it and going through this, but how do we make sure people who are trying to come out of it, to have the support networks in place to make sure that they can heal and they can balance and not fall off the tightrope. But also for people who may be exposed to it, whether at school or at work, for whatever different stressors that they have, how do we educate them? How do we break the stigma? How do we make sure that we're talking about these conversations, not only in our workplaces, but in our communities? And I thank you once again for talking with us about this important subject. I wish you all the best as you continue to write and blog and have these important conversations from your heart and your lived experience around homelessness and substance abuse, because you do make a difference and you do help people. And I think that's one of the forms of education. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you for being my guest today. And thank you for helping to amplify the concerns of the community by amplifying their voice. All the best to you.
Thank you, Mohamed.
Thank you.